Bonjour à toutes et tous.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this second day of ATHS. This section on cannabis is going to start. I'd like to give some practical information because you can see there's a small brochure written by Nicolas AUTHIER, which was published last week and which you can order, but you can get a copy here. You can see the small brochure written by Nicolas. So after the session by Piazza yesterday on medical cannabis by Nicolas AUTHIER, and I'm going to pass the floor immediately over to Amine, who's going to chair this session. And don't forget the brochure. Thank you. For those of you who got up very early this morning, despite the wind during the night, we have money on cannabis and an extension into the afternoon. I'm very happy to not have to do anything, and so I'd like to thank the speakers. We're going to begin with Nathalie Richard, who everybody knows, who is the NASM, and she's director of the Medical Cannabis Project. Thank you very much for being here. And then Nicolas AUTHIER will take the floor. We have to stick to 45 minutes, questions included. Nathalie, over to you. Thank you. I want to explain to you what the situation is in terms of experimentation for medical cannabis with some figures. Before, I'd like to talk to you about the definition. This is on the definition of what an experiment is, because often we talk about clinical trials, and so we're not, with cannabis in France, we're not talking about a clinical trial on medical cannabis. I'll talk about this later. It's not an evaluation of cannabis or the risk-benefit of cannabis. It's on experimentation. Experimentation is a method which enables public authorities to test something for a limited period of time before a decision is taken. And in the next 4 slides are taken from a state a committee which defines what France has implemented in terms of experimentation and what the conditions of experimentation are. It's a public action based on proof. It tests the efficiency and relevance of a public policy with a rigorous scientific approach and based on objective results. It finds innovative. It's objective, and it helps renew democracy and involve people in public action. It's not a clinical trial. Another important point is that experimentation is actually covered by the French Constitution. It was modified in 2003. Article 72 authorizes derogation of law on cannabis, because cannabis is, of course, forbidden in France. And so the Article 37 enables the implementation, experimentation in the public field. So until 2019, there were 269 experimentations carried out, of which 63 are continuing. And experimentation is used in social policy, in public health, and harm reduction. Clean rooms are part of experimentation. There's a derogation of the law here, and Vaccination by pharmacists against flu is another similar experimentation. There's also experimentation in education and in other fields too. Here, this is the last slide on experimentation. There are methodological principles which are essential for defining what an experimentation is, and the experimentation must follow these principles. And to implement medical use of cannabis and experimentation, we have to envisage identification, experimentation, decide on the objectives, design the experimentation. That's important. You have to define the means, identify the stakeholders, associate them in the design, choose the perimeter of experimentation and the duration and how it's going to be assessed, and that's very important too. We need to fix the way it's the method for evaluation. This is to be piloted. You have to associate stakeholders constantly and communicate on the role of experimentation. This is what we're doing with cannabis. We have to evaluate the results, determine who is going to evaluate the results using which method. And this is what the ANSM is doing with the Ministry of Health for evaluating the experimentation. And we have to decide on what happens afterwards based on the results. And then its generalization, its extension will be decided. Well, the situation of experimentation with medical cannabis in France. Initially, the ANSM initiated work on cannabis for medical purposes when, in September 2018, with the creation of a committee. It's the ANSM, on the request of the Minister of Health, who implemented this debate. There was a lot of demand by patients and health professionals and policymakers. And Olivier Véran, who at the time was spokesperson for social affairs in the National Assembly, and for this experimentation is also effective in other countries, not just France. It was necessary to evaluate this issue independently, which means that a working group was started by the NSM in October 2018 on the possible experimentation of cannabis for medical purposes. Why the NSM? Because the NSM is the competent authority and also for public policy and also drugs. And the work of this committee is about cannabis. We're not about talking about cannabis. During this work, many people from other countries were heard, Switzerland, Netherlands, Canada, about what's happening in their countries. Many patients were heard. There's the economic stakeholders too. Many societies as well, and different reviews. And following this work, the conclusion was that there was a lack of rigorous studies to formally show the efficiency of medical cannabis, but for certain symptoms or certain pathologies, there was a level of proof which was quite high and which allowed us to experiment with cannabis for medical purposes. And there was a big demand from patients and health professionals. Here you can see the key stages of the experimentation implemented by the ANSM. In 2018, the creation of the CST. In December 2018, creation of the relevance of medical cannabis. In January, we the NSM with groups made up of professionals and patients initiated work to define the framework of experimentation, and in order to secure the circuit, the 5 indications were defined in July, and also the conditions for prescription and delivery. And there's a committee which proposes the ANSM, and the NSM then comes to its conclusions. For the practical implementation of in December, we had got the green light from the National Assembly in within the framework of the law of social security to start experimenting with medical cannabis. In October, as I was saying, for the experimentation in general, there had to be a derogation for this experimentation to take place, because cannabis is forbidden for consumption, growing it, everything to do with cannabis is forbidden, so there had to be a derogation in the law, and a government body authorised this. I'll talk about the details of this in a minute. In March, I'm going through this very quickly, but in March, the decree said this experimentation had to start before the 31st of March 2021, and this took place on the 26th of March. Then we had to supply pharmacies and define who was going to prescribe medical cannabis, etc. So this began on the 26th of March, in the presence of Olivier Véran. Cannabis and any operations concerning cannabis are forbidden in France. Transport, import, export, etc. And the only derogations which are possible for cannabis are the use for research purposes. This has always been possible in France, to have clinical trials with cannabis. It's not something which, and also research on cannabis everywhere in France has always been possible because a derogation is provided for. With the first or second biggest producers in France with varieties of cannabis which are specific and which can be grown for different uses. And the third case is for medicines. This is for marketing. We have 2 marketing authorizations for cannabis. Epidiolex for epilepsy, which isn't available, and Certilex, which exists and whose authorization was granted, but is still not actually been commercialized. I'm not going to go into detail here. This is just simply to show you that as part of my experimentation, the law had to be changed. The law for financing and social security provided for this with a decree on the 7th of October of 2020 relating to experimenting with medical cannabis. Further to this, there was a decree worth around 40 pages which defines the quality conditions which must be respected for cannabis for medical purposes. And the NSM had, I don't want to say a call for tender because cannabis is free, but because the suppliers provide this free of charge during experimentation.
We've also had to have a decree to set up a registry for the follow-up of patients treated with medical cannabis. So what is at stake with this experiment. As I said, it's not a clinical trial. This is just to, so to speak, test a new public health policy. So the first objective is to check the validity of the prescription circuit or path, but as far as the various committees under the aegis of the French Health Authority were made of physicians who wanted to get data on the efficiency and the risk of medical cannabis, this experiment and through the registry has allowed to the register has allowed to get a certain number of data and to set up a pharmacovigilance system. And of course, in the long run, the idea is to assess if and whether medical cannabis can be generalized. Now, who is this for? 3,000 patients were said to be included and followed up during the course of this experiment. Actively followed up. That is that any patient leaving the cohort could be replaced by another. 5 indications were kept, which show a sufficient level of evidence for the effectiveness of cannabis. So neuropathies that cannot be treated with conventional treatments, some type of epilepsies that are pharmaco-resistant, so certain oncological symptoms, some palliative situations, and the painful spasticity of multiple sclerosis, as well as other central nervous diseases. The experiment started on the 26th of March and will finish in 2023. The follow-up is made by health professionals, and that's very important in this experiment. In fact, all health professionals that take part in this experiment have to undertake a training, which is absolutely compulsory. Same for pharmacists. They have to validate their training. The drugs used are oils, oil per os, and since August, we now have the floral tops that are sprayed with a medical device as selected in order to spray the floral tops. So as this is in fact an alcohol activity, we have to have a safe prescription. Now, for this experiment, we tried to secure the system and to make sure it was it was under control. So we defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that's the first point. Then we also secured the prescription. Initiation of or installment of medical cannabis treatment can only be done by centers who are voluntary centers. This has been defined with the various academic societies. So only physicians can take, and pharmacists can take place in this experiment. They're all voluntary, free-willingly included in this experiment. So we now have a list of structures and physicians and pharmacists, which is available on the site of the experiment. So training is mandatory for everyone. As we said, we also secure the follow-up of patients. So the only difference is that in order to get a medical cannabis, a patient has to be part of a register. If the patient accepts to take part in the experiment, it means that the patient accepts to be part of the follow-up register, which has been set up by the French Health Authority. Of course, there's an informed consent form. The patient is informed about everything, and there is also an authorization needed from the patient so that he or she can provide his patient identity number for the social welfare system. One more important point, the security of the medicaments, of the drugs used for the medicines or used for this experiment. So we, of course, are very much cautious about the quality of the medical cannabis. So a call for tender was launched on the basis of the specifications that were published by the state. So the characteristics of the drugs, the composition, the quality, quantity characteristics of the product, etc., were defined. All the replies obtained were checked for conformity. And all the producers, of course, or manufacturers had to follow the specifications. All medicines being imported are first of all checked by the French health agency's laboratories for each batch, I mean. And at any time, the French health authority can also have unexpected controls. And I'm nearly done. So today we are 6 months after the beginning of the experiment. So it's a bit like the weather forecast. We like to check how people get into the experiment. And that's quite an important point. So let me tell you about our latest review, which is just 1 week old. As we get information on a daily basis, thanks to the register. And as I said before, we have a follow-up of this experiment undertaken by a committee made of health professionals and patients with a sharing of experience. So it's very important to follow the experiment in this way. And it's also a good way to adjust things. As it is a 2 years, it's an experiment that covers a 2-year span. We want to adapt it to the situation. We also communicate on, well, I would say on a daily basis with the health professional by mail, but also with the producers and the manufacturers. And only recently we had a webinar with 300 health professionals to have their opinion and the possibilities of improving the experiment. So just 2 weeks ago, we had 848 patients, and today we are having now 897 patients. Fresh news from this morning. And nearly reaching 900. This is why I'm getting emotional, speaker says. So with we have 680 patients who've already quit. So we have a total of 690 patients being followed up. It can be because of side effects, but also because of a lack of efficiency of the medicine. So the 3 major indications are therefore neuropathies, neurological pain. It's the biggest number of patients in the experiment. And then in equal shares, we have epilepsy and multiple, or seizures and multiple sclerosis. We also have spastic cases outside MS, but also oncology and palliative care, with many less patients for these 3 other areas. But we'll try to change this. As we saw before, this experiment is undertaken by trained professionals. So we have altogether general practitioners and pharmacists. So we have very few patients who've appointed a GP to follow them, but half of them have already appointed their pharmacist for the course of this experiment. So we have 508 patients who've had a training and 315 pharmacists being registered. They're altogether registered and trained. They have to register on the one hand, and then they have to undergo the training, the proper training. So we have 226 centers part of the experiment. 201 have at least one trained pharmacist, and all reference structures. It's not all of them who've had patients. This may be related to the COVID situation. That is that the GPs included didn't have time to include patients because it takes time. Since the beginning, we already have made some adjustments. Particularly, we have changed the register concerning pharmacovigilance, and also concerning a certain number of elements which lacked detailed information. We also changed training. We shortened it. We've had feedback that the training was too complex. We shortened it. And we stopped applying quotas per GP and per center. That is that the centers who wish to have more patients, can do it. We've had also a certain number of quality issues, wrong manipulation of the files, etc. So we've had to reinforce the procedures. And we will soon allow a broader inclusion of cancer patients and palliative patients. So we will change the inclusion criteria, which were perhaps a little restrictive. Now, following the experiment, which is aimed at generalizing the use of medical cannabis, we can possibly validate other indications, not during the experiment, but after the experiment. So we will consider these new indications. And as you know, the idea is to have a French line of production, so we're working on this in parallel. And of course, the next step is the assessment of the experiment, so as to produce a report for the government 6 months before the end. And of course, the status of medical cannabis will have to be defined, as well as the conditions for its generalization. Thank you, Nathalie. Well, 45 minutes is a short time span, but that was interesting for you to present the point of view of the French Health Agency. I suggest we listen to Nicolas AUTHIER so that we have some time afterwards for a general discussion.
Bon, moi, ce que je voulais faire très rapidement pour laisser un peu de temps aux questions, c'était juste vous présenter une petite vignette clinique.
I just wanted to show you some clinical aspects, observational aspects concerning a patient whom I followed up, among others. I selected a patient who is an addicted patient. As you saw, this is not just for this kind of patients, but I selected a patient who can be quite interesting for us because he also uses cannabis in addition to this medical cannabis. I could have shown you patients with failed treatment, but I didn't want to show that. I'm just going to show you the history of this particular patient.
De l'autothérapeutique au médical, parce que finalement c'est un patient qui est venu me voir, qui m'a demandé d'être inclus dans l'expérimentation, que je ne connaissais pas.
So this patient came to me and asked to be included in the experiment because he had some refractory neurological pain, 32 years old, who's been on sick leave since February 2020, and who's having a divorce, so a very uncomfortable situation for 2 years. So he is having a peripheral neurological pain on the upper right arm following a trauma on the forearm and hand. He's had 8 surgeries and he now has nerve lesions that are painful, plus surgical complications which have exacerbated this neurological pain. This has been on for 11 years with an intensity that varies between 8 and 10. So a feeling of pain, of crushing, of knife stabs, pins and needles, etc. All these symptoms are assessed as 8 to 10 in terms of intensity. Besides, this patient uses cannabis and used it before this trauma, probably because of a certain, I would say, anxiety environment in this patient. It was he was probably using cannabis as a kind of self-treatment of autotherapy, because he observed that he felt better, a little better when he was using cannabis, but he had a consumption of 5 grams a day already. So quite a big user. He was smoking all day long, so to speak. Besides, he was also having treatments in addition to cannabis. So this is what he had on the left and what I did on the right. So he was treated with all these conventional drugs for neurological pain, such as opiates, bromazepam, nanserine, etc. This was set up by his GP to improve his sleeping disorders. He also smoked cannabis flowers, but the effects were quite moderate. So 20% improvement, he said, following this. He sees a GP, a neurologist, and a psychiatrist, and also a pain doctor. When I first saw the patient, so he had intense pain. You can see the figures. I let you read the figures on the screen in terms of scores, because I cannot read them from here, and the speaker speaks too fast. So what I did is this: I prescribed. Sorry for being so fast, speaker says, but we started prescribing a CBD oil. And this is an example to show you that you can increase the dose level. So we had twice 40 milligrams per os. The rest, at 2 months, the pain was the same. But he still found some kind of improvement. To me, it wasn't that easy, but the patient showed a slight improvement. Sometimes patients just want us to be happy and do not want to confess that it doesn't work. So you want to check that, because it's pretty annoying. Depression 15, anxiety slightly decreased, 11 instead of 15. General condition 40, no change. It seems that he smokes a little less, although this has not been quantified, but maybe his consumption is slightly less and he's perhaps slightly less anxious. So I continue increasing the CBD dose level up to 120 milligrams per day. That is 60 morning, 60 evening. It's not very high, though. And after 2 weeks, that is on week 6, I included a THC oil. That is the titration of CBD is further extended by the titration of THC. We have to find the right ratio between these two substances. We try to find the good equilibrium. So we obtained a moderate pain, a slight improvement, and I would say a general condition that is better, and a decrease in the use of cannabis. So I continued increasing THC. It was 10 milligrams a day, and now I increased to 30 milligrams per day. CBD was still 120 milligrams. So pain, it remains moderate. Intensity is now 3. The patient says is improved. You can tell when you see him during consultation. He's changed, the way he walks, the way he behaves, the way he speaks. There's a real change in this patient. His mood is improved, anxiety is improved, despite all the personal difficulties he's having. The divorce is awful. His conditions, general status is also good. And we have a decrease of his personal consumption to 2 grams per week instead of 5 grams per day. So part of his consumption was, of course, I would say, of therapeutic nature. Then I increased THC to 40 milligrams per day with still 120 CBDs. And this is the situation on Tuesday last, that is 2 days ago, when I saw the patient again. So the 120 CBD, 40 THC, in improvement of the general condition, but also improvement of the pain, the anxiety. Sleep is improved. He feels much more lively, and he says that the treatment he's having is more effective than the cannabis he was smoking before. Remember, he was smoking 5 milligrams, so it's not quite the same thing. Maybe it's also because he's being supported, but it's not the same product anyway. So the patient seems stabilized. So this is my last prescription. THC oil 40 milligrams, CBD 120, and I started flowers. So I prescribed dried flowers to spray 10 grams of flowers with a whole procedure to follow. I gave him a booklet to explain the strategy and the objectives. So there are times in the day where he has some painful peaks, which can be pretty high, and this is when we can add the spraying of flowers. Last slide. So this medical cannabis is, of course, just an experiment. We still do not know how to handle it, and others who've been using it for longer do not know much better than us, because there's not so much research on the subject. So it's a complex mix of substances that treats the patient, I would say, as a globally, not just pain. In fact, when we treat these patients, we know that we cannot remove pain totally, so we're interested in the whole status. And obviously, CBD has an effect on the patient as a whole, and not just on pain. So we just increases the dose level by adding then afterwards a little bit of THC to try and find the right equilibrium and the right balance, and see if it is beneficial for the patient. If it doesn't work, then we have to stop, because we know that for this pain you cannot want to do too much. Okay, so thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you, Nicolas. You have showed this case. This case report is quite interesting indeed. So I have a few questions about the way in which you manage your patients. You increased THC more than CBD, actually. You started with 10 and continued up to 40 with the addition of flowers. Now, the first improvement we saw was subjective. It felt just a little less anxious. Then the improvement, the objective improvement of pain appeared I would say, in parallel with the increase of THC. Can we draw a conclusion from this? Of course, I'm being provocative here. Is this related to CBD or to THC, or the ratio between CBD and THC? Well, I'm afraid I cannot draw any conclusions. This was quite empirical. Why didn't I go as high as 200? There are figures that we cannot trespass because it is not allowed by the French health agencies. So it varies a lot, in fact, depending on people.
Comment ça d'une médecine expérimentale, c'est pas pour démonter le projet du tout, c'est que vraiment c'est l'impression qu'on.
So in fact, the question is about what you have to do with patients, but it's a good, yeah, well, never mind. You have to try and find the improvement by little increases, and you also have to be aware of side effects. Well, he just had minor effects like diarrhea, so digestive problems, and this is quite characteristic of CBD. Do we have a roving mic in the room? Okay, good. I have two questions, one for each of you. Nicolas, I do not understand. If we want to test medical cannabis, there's in fact very little, a very small amount of CBD in cannabis. So we don't know exactly what CBD does. But in my view, it's a compound which is much more at risk than THC. So why? I know that some have tried to insist on having a balance of 50% CBD, 50% THC, but there is absolutely no scientific background to this. So why are you making your life miserable with this? With using something which is probably active, but we don't know how it works. I mean, CBD, particularly for chronic pain. We know that THC is certainly much more effective with side effects, of course, but it is certainly much more likely to have a better effect. So why this mix between CBD and THC? Well, it is because most countries who've started experimenting this before us did it. So we just followed them. Maybe it's a kind of fear of THC, I don't know, but it is the strategy that was proposed by foreign experts, and they all told us that this was quite empirical, but we don't know why. Then one short question. So what you do in France is fine. The idea is to have a legal status for medical cannabis, but my question is this. What is this medical cannabis status going to be? I know that in some countries it's a huge issue to have a medical drug which has side effects. Knowing that besides medical cannabis until now has no legal status as a proper medical drug.
No status for medical cannabis. All countries are the same. We agree that France is not a specific case. We don't currently have a status for medical cannabis with a benefit, with a risk benefit ratio. We wouldn't be on medical cannabis. But the second part of your question, the speaker doesn't have a microphone. I can't answer that question. We have gone over time now, so I'll take a few questions, and I apologize for the following session. I'm president founder of CDH Association in Paris, called Partout Pareil, and I'd like to ask a question to Mrs. Richard. Thank you for your presentation. You insist on it's not a question of clinical trials for the public at large. I don't think that people overall really understand this. There are many parents who think that because CBD or medical cannabis exists and they have concluded that it's already authorized, and many parents are already envisage giving CBD oil to their children. So do you envisage communicating on this point? I agree that there's a lack of communication on this subject. The public at large needs to receive much more information on this. The danger of parents who put their children on CBD within this framework can also be dangerous. We don't know what's in that CBD which is circulating. There's also work about on controlling these products. That's one of the dangers. But however, for the new indications which will be implemented, this will be at the end of the year. We will hear from health professionals, associations of patients, and try to extend this afterwards to other indications, and possibly this one. A final question, very short now. I'm a psychiatrist, and my question concerns experimentation, not only on an addicted population. Are they excluded from experimentation or not? And should we, will we have data at the end of this experimentation on the usage of cannabis on a population of addicts who are using this as self-medication? It's not a counterindication. When we implemented the register, we asked the CNIL, which didn't want any information about consumption, illegal consumption of cannabis to be recorded, so this doesn't appear in the register. Drugs are so taboo that you can't even record this information in a register. We can only have this information if it's in the patient's records. Thank you to you all.